know, as a Texan, we talk about the great heroes from Texas and the politicians and the colorful history. And we've talked about President Lyndon Johnson a few times. We discussed him in the episode that we did on election fraud, and he was actually the king of it. He created voters from the graveyard, and he found ballots and so forth. Very colorful man, larger than life. But he's also known for the war on poverty. That's something that he decided that America should focus on. Now, there's a story that claims that the reason he did this wasn't really to solve the problem of poverty. It was more a voter harvesting technique, and he used a colorful phrase that's really not appropriate to say, we'll get this community voting for us for the next 200 years. The problem is the war on poverty is an abject failure. We've spent more than $20 trillion. Yes, the entire federal budget debt can be attributed to the so-called war on poverty since Johnson was president. There are better solutions. There are better approaches. I want you to join me in the Economic War Room, where we're going to talk to two individuals who've been on the front lines fighting for justice, fighting for communities, fighting with compassion and caring. This, my friends, Randy Skinner and Bishop Harry Jackson. So welcome, gentlemen, to the Economic War Room. Let's talk about better solutions to the problems we face in inner communities. So let's start with you, Bishop Jackson. You have been fighting this battle for a couple of decades now. I've known you for more than 20 years, I would suppose, and you've just been in the fight on the front lines. Tell us about the High Impact Coalition that you're part of.
Well, the High Impact Leadership Coalition was originally formed to bring an agenda forth with black and white Christians united in what I would call a righteousness and justice kind of orientation. I believe that in our urban areas, many of our black, Hispanic, Asian leaders believe that there's a lack of justice as they see in the Bible. And I'm talking about biblical justice, not a politicized social justice that hasn't got its mores in the Bible or moorings. But also our white community believes in righteousness. We're pro-life. We're pro things that preserve the families. And I wanted to bring righteousness and justice together and create an agenda. So today we've got about 7,000 churches that work with us, both in the United States and abroad. We believe that the local church in urban communities especially has got to be involved in preaching the gospel, discipling individuals, winning souls, but also reforming culture. And Johnson heard us because he advocated the destruction of our families by giving more money to women who remained unmarried and had multiple children, and not reinforcing what I'm going to call biblically oriented structures like the father-led family. And when you break the father-led family down and do not build it up, it creates generational lack and poverty. And we can go into more details later, but that's the overview of where Johnson failed and actually did generational damage to my and Hispanic communities.
Well, there's no doubt. And Randy, you've seen this on the ground firsthand, both in Dallas and in Palm Beach. Tell us what your experience has been.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, actually, our work started in Atlanta, Georgia, where we worked with young black youth that had been murdered, going back to the Atlanta child murders. Then our organization worked in Southern California with gangs and drugs. We then went to the rural areas of Mississippi, where you saw a lot of poverty, but we were working on old civil rights cases there. And then we were asked to come into Dallas at the time, which was the most church city in the nation, but it also had the highest crime, highest poverty. We were really losing our inner city. And so we came to Dallas, and we've been here 18 years, and we've taken one of the worst, most violent zip codes in the nation and in the city, the 11th poorest zip code in the nation, and through a different approach to poverty and blight, homelessness, and crime, a free enterprise approach. Today it's the safest zip code in the city.
Wow. All right, so let's talk about this. There really are, in the election, we're seeing two distinct choices. We're seeing a collectivist choice, which is a nanny-state approach where the government is in control of everything with basically socialism. And it's become a popular word, actually, in the political scene. And we're seeing individual liberty led by biblical justice. Given those two choices, now there's a third choice, which is a bad choice. I want to throw that out, which is crony capitalism, which is, get everything that you can. But I want to talk about the two choices that I think that are on the ballot today for believers. Tell us, why are they so different? Which works better, and what have you seen? Bishop Jackson?
Well, I think if you look at the biblical capitalistic model, it goes all the way back to Canaan. I don't want to be too extremely biblical, but its foundation is a word. God gave home ownership, tribal property, the ability in an agrarian society to earn what you make, and if you worked harder, you could do better. That was what was part of the promised land. And I think in our generation, what's happened is that we have a lot of people who are at the bottom of the barrel financially and with opportunities who have lost sight of the fact that they can and should be empowered to rise up to take ownership of their own lives. What's missing in the Hispanic and Black communities, and what our dear friend with you from Dallas has done, is that he added churches and faith to the equation, and the church becomes a coach for individuals to relearn what should have been passed on generationally so that people can be taught how to fish instead of being on the handout system. The choices are clear. Trump has, in fact, a low unemployment level for all minorities. We've got the opportunity zones will bring jobs to the hood. We've got criminal justice reform, which is included in the opportunity zones, meaning people returning from prison, nonviolent offenders can get a job. We can revamp things on a capitalistic model, but we've got to choose Trump versus a socialistic nanny state solution.
Well, you mentioned churches making the big difference, and that's what rolled in and changed. Why are churches more effective than the government, for example? Why can't the government just get in there and we'll just solve the problem and here's plenty of money? And why does that fail and the churches succeed?
Well, let's look at a case study. A case study is the history of the war on poverty, which we saw for decades being lost and more people being enrolled in WIC, SNAP, and CHIP. Those are all acronyms for different welfare programs. And what happened when President George W. Bush came in, from the state of Texas, he had created a faith-based office for the purpose in the state of Texas, getting people off of government assistance and letting the church be the answer. So he took that to the White House when he became president. It became the faith-based office of the White House. And from there, he told every cabinet, whether it was Justice, HUD, USDA, Health and Human Services, or Education, you're going to have a faith component. And the goal is to take those programs that are pushed down through those agencies and take and bring in the church to be an answer. So for example, in Dallas, what we did is we partnered with the U.S. Justice Department. We created a task force that came into this 11th poorest zip code, most violent zip code, which, to help your viewers understand, was a 10 square mile area. It was 5,000 homes, 13 communities, 27,000 people. And this was the blight. It was a 100-year-old blight where Bonnie and Clyde lived. Wow. And all the crime that was for 100 years, and drugs and blight and crime came out of that zip code. So through the faith-based office, we created a criminal justice task force, and that task force led the effort with the church community to completely eradicate crime. And the way we did that is we went in and we created heat maps where we actually knew where every drug dealer, every prostitution house was, where all the car theft stings were, operations were. And then we created an economic housing team. We created a health and wellness team. We created an education team and a spiritual team.
Why was the spiritual team important? What makes this effort different with a church as opposed to without a church?
The different approach was first when you, and every infill property throughout the United States, an infill property is properties that are closer to the downtowns. And everyone has moved out of those areas generationally to go to the suburbs to escape crime. Today what we've realized is infill properties is the most expensive property and most valuable property that you can have. But you got to take out crime. So we figured out a way to take out the crime, but the way to do that is we planted missionaries in what I call the harvest field, if you're going to use church terms, because what we do is we do a study of every individual, and then we do a study of the churches. And what we found in most infield, impoverished, blighted areas, the church is weak. So we brought in missionaries to live on every block, and they become the church, tied to a local church and tied to a church in the city, and they become the hands and the feet to actually minister to people. So in my own family, we moved into this 11th poorest zip code, most violent zip code, and I raised my children there. I had 70 new homes we had built. We bought out 400 drug houses, built a whole subdivision, all first-time homeowners. They bought their homes through bank loans and through a free enterprise system, and they succeed. They experience the American dream, but it's the church component that makes it succeed.
It's the spiritual. You brought the light of Christ to the community, and the light of Christ made a difference. Now, I want to contrast that. I've got an article here that is from 2012 that was written, How Obama is Robbing the Suburbs to Pay for the Cities. The Obama administration had a very different approach to dealing with this problem. They said, well, the suburbs are prosperous, the cities are poor, therefore we'll take money, which is socialism, right? We'll take money from the suburbs and put it in the cities. Did that work?
No, it didn't work. It's obvious by the results that President Trump is getting now. But I want to applaud Randy and say what you've got with what he did in West Dallas is an operationalization, if you will, of Christian ideology. The missing ingredient has been the plan, boots on the ground, which he had, but also discipleship or changing the mind of the individuals. Obama thought that you just write a check, transfer money to a region without transforming the thinking of the individual. If I give you something you tear up the second week you own it, then I haven't solved the problem. Crime stays in. What we're finding is that many communities around the nation, you heard about this in the news, are simply paying, they're doing it in New York, paying money to people who are homeless, shipping them somewhere. D.C. shipped people upstate Maryland out of the urban center. And the people, when they got to the new place, just replicate old behavior because their mind has not been engaged. That's what the church has got to do for individuals with specific discipleship programs, I would call it in the old day, and that could take the form of after-school programs. Educational gap closure is taking place of teaching people how to handle their finances, gaining home ownership. Only 41% of blacks own their homes, 70-some% of whites. I'll stop there.
I want to applaud you for what you've been doing and where you see that distinct difference between the light of Christ with opportunity versus excluding God from government programs, which is something I think the people on the left want to do. I remember President Reagan said, if we ever forget we're one nation under God, we will be a nation gone under. And no program that we give, no government involvement can save this nation if we don't have that recognition that we're founded as a nation under God.
Well, that's absolutely true. But again, we've got to do more than just give great pulpit messages. Empowering individuals, and the word discipleship, which means teaching someone, equipping someone to do something they couldn't do before, is a part of the answer. And I submit to you that Randy's model is going to be adopted nationwide. It's going to be a part of how we do things. but we're also going to have to take pastors like my high impact group away on retreats and teach them how to teach people with a call to action which says, okay, folks, we need to give you some oversight over your budget. We need to remind you about a child rearing, the role of a man and a woman in the context of marriage, and all these things we think are just almost instinctive need to be taught one generation to another.
You know, what I'm hearing you say is we have to do both. You have to have the spiritual component, it won't work without it, but you also have to have the boots on the ground, the programs, the effort to train people to be a part of an ownership society. Free markets work if we have moral, democratic, free enterprise or moral democratic capitalism where the opportunity is available for everyone. But if you pull one of those components out, if you don't make it available for everyone, it fails. If you don't make it moral, based on God's word and truth, it will fail. And if you don't make it liberty, free markets, it will fail. Is that?
Absolutely, and we have two opposing philosophies. And again, going back to what President George W. Bush attempted to do through the faith-based office, and I've served under Democratic and Republican mayors, and I was just recently appointed by the governor of Texas and reappointed to deal with the faith-based office here in Texas. And even though now I live in Florida and have resigned from that. But here's what happened is when President Obama came into office, he was mentored by a individual who began showing him that the way to change America through less of a free market approach, a more socialist approach, and big government was through the faith-based office. So, and I was an advisor to the Obama administration for about 6 years where I worked with them, because I worked with every president, worked with Reagan, Bush, and now the current administration. But what he did was he took the faith-based office and he said, let's infuse more government cash into all of these nonprofits and faith-based groups, and let's give them government cash to accomplish ending hunger, ending poverty, and getting people on insurance. But what he did is he actually rewarded people to keep people on government assistance rather than helping them through a free enterprise market get off of the system. That's why we saw a ballooning of all the government assistance programs, because I was appointed by the mayor of Dallas to deal with hunger and deal with some crime and poverty. And when the federal government would come back to me and I would say, look how much money I saved, they said, oh no, spend all of it. I was offered $500 million to deal with hunger problems by the Obama administration. And when I would say, here's where we can save, and here's where we can come up with co-ops and free enterprise market systems where people actually own these free enterprise feeding programs themselves through the church and through faith-based groups, and then we're getting people off of government assistance. They rejected it.
I want to hold you over. I want to do a whole other episode on that, Randy. That's fantastic. So we're going to cover that in more detail. With you, Bishop Jackson, I want to get one thing that you started off with, which was the importance of the family. And you mentioned how important it is to maintain the family. We're seeing something happen, and I don't know how to exactly describe it, but it's kind of amazing to people with the family of Kanye West and the Kardashians and all that. We saw them going down one path, and all of a sudden we're seeing that family go down a different path, and the change there is dramatic, at least from the public's perception. I even have an article here where Kanye West says, can Kanye West solve LA's housing crisis? Not if city bureaucrats get in the way. Here's a man who wanted, with compassion, to take 300 acres of property, and he wanted to make it possible for homeless to have a place to go. And I think he was going to follow some of this model, and the government stepped in and said no. The government doesn't seem to be pro-family. The government doesn't seem to be pro-individual. Can you tell us how you've seen the government interfere in ways, and what we can do and what we should do to get them out of the way?
Well, it was actually, Randy alluded to it earlier. The fact that budgets must be reinforced, and the idea meaning if you're going to keep your money, your power, you got to use up the money you have from the year before. And the idea is money solves all things versus giving a time limit and some objective goals to various operations. So I think we need to have more of a model. I have an MBA from Harvard Business School, as you may remember. So I'm not a stranger to how high-level economics works. We need more of a venture capital model at the root of community economic restoration. What we're dealing with the opportunity zones is much more like, here's an incentive, get jobs, get sustainable housing for people that need to work or live near where they work, make sure the community is safe, and that ties into Randy's model. I think what Kanye is trying to understand now is that communal living of the 60s and 70s mindset and having everything in common, that's not the way forward. The way forward is create jobs, create housing and home ownership, reduce the educational gap, and thus there's a generational lift of all the boats there in one community. That's a radical different way of thinking. And again, when you deal with families, people that don't own homes pass on typically $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 to the next generation. The average home ownership transfer of wealth is more like $150,000 per family. So if you could just get people in a safe community with a good job, with prospects of home ownership, you will create an atmosphere where they can see in one generation their work rewarded. And I think Kanye will discover that the more biblical approach will produce fruit that will remain.
We're looking at 2020, maybe the largest, most important election of our lifetime. And we're looking at communities that you deal with regularly, the Black community, the Hispanic community, the young community, and the millennial voters. And all three of those communities, we're told by the media, those belong automatically to the Democratic Party. And you feel that's a bad decision for each of those communities. Can you explain that?
Yes, it is. What we need is a biblically based Candace Owens type person, along with an initiative that will reach out and talk to where these people are. And what I've done in terms of recent work, we've created an 11-city tour in swing states and cities, and we're going to take on the road a host of Black and Hispanic speakers who are going to present another way of looking at things. We're going to use regional megachurches as well as social media to reach out to that younger demographic. And then what we're simply going to do is say, here's the problem. In our opinion, there's an education gap, there's a wealth gap, and then there's a life gap. Minorities are disproportionately aborting their babies and therefore losing economic and political power. And I won't go into the entire pitch today, but essentially in these critical places, if the minority vote can be shifted 5 to 7%, the minority vote, we're going to find that it's going to make a huge difference. George Bush won because of a shift with Black voters and Hispanic voters. I believe that Mr. Trump is going to do extremely well if we go into places like our tour and then give some testimonials, show people who've gotten out of prison, got jobs, talk about home ownership, talk about these issues. This is the need of the hour, Kevin, in my opinion.
Well, let me ask two other questions. One is, are you telling me Donald Trump's not a racist?
Oh, he's definitely not a racist. But the real issue is he's been cast as a racist. And we're at a time in our history, after Obama, you'll find this in Pew Research, that you'll find that the Pew Research numbers say the perception of racism has dramatically gone up across the Obama years into the Trump years. And people are acting as though Mr. Trump created racism. But there was a day when we had open lynchings, we had torture, we had all kinds of problems, and we're now at a defining moment that I think the church unifying and winning over people who already believe in righteousness and justice is the quickest way for Mr. Trump to get in office again, and perhaps Pence after him. But over long term, I think that the Republican Party has got to go back to its abolitionist roots and its biblical roots and say that it needs a new kind of conservatism that's reinfused with the religious fervor. And I'm not talking about Bible thumping. I'm talking about capitalistic public policies that she espouses openly and connect the dots. You're a single mom, here's how freedom and liberty works for you. You're a dad who's estranged from her kids, you're returning from prison. Here's how conservative values help you reclaim your life. If we give testimonials and interpretations of truths like that, I believe that we can create a shift in this dumbed down, democratically leaning mindset that allows the Democrats to show up Sunday before the Tuesday. It's like we're in an adulterous relationship. They come to our door at midnight. They want what they want and how they want it. And afterwards, we don't get dinner. We don't get romance. We don't get any flowers. There's nothing. And that's got to shift on our watch.
You know, and that's the second point that I want to make from what I heard. Second point is, if I heard you correctly, the political power of the Black, Hispanic, and young person community actually increases if they will look out for their interests rather than just saying, I'm automatically sold out. You're actually empowering people through politics for their interests and their community.
Well, that's exactly right. Blacks and Hispanics and Asians, put them all together, you could have almost a third of the voting strength of America. These communities are heavy in faith. So if we could, in fact, get this Christian-based agenda and say to them, hey guys, ultimately, don't care what party you're part of, if you'll accept these principles, and I'm going to put out in a few weeks a little bit of I'm going to call it a Christian manifesto, a black contract with America, if you will. And if you could focus on 2 or 3 things that if you're in the Democratic Party, go to the platform committee. Don't you be a bystander. Don't you be a chump that's taken advantage of. And if you're in the Republican Party, it's going to take some people with courage to come out of the Democratic Party, to enter the Republican Party and say, hey guys, I'm going to support and I'm going to do what I can to not only vote, I'm going to give a little bit of money. And so blowing this kind of trumpet within the walls of an already Christian audience is what we're going to do city by city in these swing areas. And I believe, again, you only need 5 to 7% of the minority vote, not the national vote, to shift. And Mr. Trump is in again, and a new mindset can be engaged.
That's fantastic. That actually increases Black, Hispanic, Asian, and young people political power by opening their eyes and seeing the truth. Thank you so much, Bishop Jackson. Well, you heard it. Bishop Harry Jackson has a formula for empowering Black Americans, empowering Hispanics, empowering Asians, empowering these communities, and especially young people, by just not being lemmings and going all one direction or the other. There are principles of truth that apply here, and he's applying them, and we applaud Bishop Harry Jackson for his excellent work. This is Kevin Freeman from the Economic War Room.